Okay, octaves. Let me explain what octaves are, and then we'll jump back and talk about how they relate to pitch classes and pitches. So let's just first analyze the word octave, right? We know probably a little bit about what this means. Octave comes from the root of the word octave, comes from the same thing, the same reason we call an octopus, and an octagon, and an octet, which is that it's something based around the number 8, right? So I've already said we only have 7 unique pitch names. So why do we have something based around the number 8? It makes perfect sense if you think about it. Let's use A as our example. So let's count up 8, right? A, B, C, D, that's 4. E, F, G, that's 7. We go up one more, 8. That means it's the same pitch class, right? Something that's 8 notes away. So if we go from this first note and we say, this is our first note, and we count up 8 pitches, we get the same pitch class. And that is an octave. So these notes are related by something called an octave. So why do we care about octaves? Octaves are very important. Octaves have a very similar sound. Let's do this again. So here are 4 different A's, and they are A's in different octaves. This is a high octave. This is a low octave. This is somewhere in the middle of an octave. So we have high octave. We have the space in between is called an octave. Okay, and the relationship of this note to this note is an octave. Whether it's going down or it's going up, we still call it an octave. We don't really differentiate between whether it's a higher octave or a lower octave in this sense. So the reason that we lump these together, and the reason that they get the same name, the reason that these are all called an A, is because they have a very distinct similarity in the way that they sound. They sound really similar. These are in one way, playing this note and then this note and then this note is kind of like playing the same note 3 times because they're very similar in the way that they sound. If we were to analyze these on like a frequency thing, like if we looked at the actual frequencies that were coming out, they would be related by a 1-to-2 ratio, which let's not get into ratios. Forget I said that. That gets too weird. Let me just say that these notes always sound good together, right? Let's do them all at the same time. Right? It sounds good. It's not going to be dissonant. Right? That's a sound that is always going to sound good. So if you're writing something and you're thinking, how can I make this more interesting? Add an octave. Add the same note, but an octave higher or an octave lower, and it's going to sound really interesting. Let's take, for example, some melody. Okay, Mary Had a Little Lamb. Now, let's add an octave lower. So now we have Mary Had a Little Lamb up here and Mary Had a Little Lamb down here, and that's going to sound just fine because those are octaves, right? I haven't really added any meaty, crunchy, dissonant notes. octaves will always sound good together. Let's just hear that. Right? So it's pretty easy. So how that relates to pitch classes, right? We know that, let's look back here. So we have 7 different notes and then the octave, right? So what we're looking at here is 7 notes what we're looking at here is 8 different pitches, 7 different pitch classes, right? Because this is the same pitch class. Actually, let's do it here too. This is maybe a little easier to make my point. These 4 notes are all the same pitch class, right? Because they're all A's, but they're separated by an octave. So they're not exactly the same note because they're an octave different, but they're the same pitch class with an octave in it, separated by an octave. As we move on, keep in mind this. A lot of what we're going to be doing in music theory is looking at different intervals, right? And an interval is a space between 2 notes. So from, let's say, this note to that note, that is an interval, and that means something to us. When we work with different pitches, the space between 2 notes is where things get really interesting. That's where we start really picking apart, why do those 2 notes sound good together, or why do they not? And it has to do with a thing called the interval, the space in between those 2 notes. So our first interval that we've learned, and we've already learned it, is the interval of an octave. This is from F to F. And we know that the interval of an octave pretty much always sounds good. It has a character where those 2 notes, no matter what 2 pitches you use, no matter what pitch class you use, whether it's an F, a G, an A, a B, if you add an octave on it, it's going to sound good. That's just how octaves work. They sound good together. Cool. So that's how octaves work. Now, before we go on to the next thing, I want to give you a little practice sheet. So in the next little blip in this class, you will have the opportunity to do a little practice. You can do these however you want. You can do them, you can not do them. It's totally up to you. But I'm going to do these throughout this class. This is, just like learning anything. This takes practice to really understand this stuff. So if you already know the basics of how to read music, then, skip over this one and get to the more meaty stuff. If some of the stuff I've covered in this first chunk is difficult, which is totally fine because it is difficult, then try to do the practice exercises that'll be included in the next chunk. And when you get stumped, jump back and watch these videos again, and then make sure you understand it before you move on. That's the way to really learn this stuff. Now, in the practice worksheet example that I give you in the next video, I will also include the answers. So try not to look at the answers until you have a good guess, until you think you got it. If you think you got it, then look at the answer. And if you got it, awesome. If you didn't get it, then go back and review these videos and keep going. You can watch these videos as many times as you want. There's no harm in that. It's actually encouraged. Okay, so up next, our first little practice sheet, and then we'll move on to talk about how all of this relates to this thing, which you've seen before. It looks like a piano keyboard. Off we go.